Just give me a second. Please kindly confirm that you can see it. See my presentation in full screen mode.
Yes, sir. You can see your screen, and I've started the recording.
Okay, thank you. So, great. So, this session is on nanotechnology and nanoscience towards lab-on-a-chip devices. So, as you have seen in the first few modules of the course, I have been by this time introduced to um, various technologies related to a lab-on-a-chip thing, and you understand it is a combination of fluid flow, material science, chemical engineering, reactions, electronics at certain point of time, and those things. And mostly these need to happen in a very confined situation, small situations. And typically, these happen on a range of millimeter to micrometer scales. However, with the advent of manufacturing technology, it is very much possible to reduce these dimensions further and reach a scale of nanometer level of 10 to the power minus 9 meters to be precise. So, technically, the term nano is used when one of the characteristic dimensions of the channel is of the order of uh, about is between 1 to 100 nanometers. And when we incorporate such a conduit for a LOC device, we say that has entered into the purview of nanotechnology, and we need to study it separately. So, however, with the understanding that we have obtained in this course by this time, you understand that from the continuum description of equations, when you shift to microscale, you incorporate certain changes. So by intuition, you would say, okay, so micro is 10 to the power minus 6 and nano is 10 to the power minus 9. So if we are moving to nanoscience, so it is just order of magnitude difference, and we would multiply everything with 10 to the power minus 3, and we would use the same equation, same physics to understand everything. However, it doesn't work that way. And the novel aspects of that would be presented in the next 2 hours. Okay. So at this point, while we start the lecture, let me tell you, let us try to keep this session very interactive. So please feel free to stop me whenever you want, ask questions, we can discuss, because the questions are important. It cannot be one way monologue. Also, yeah, we are in an online mode of things, so sometimes your questions might not be audible to me. Please feel free to stop me and shout it out and ask the questions. Okay, so let us start with the presentation. Before we start the presentation, just one small confirmation. Can you see the scribbling with the stylus?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, great. So let us start. So here is a brief outline of the presentation. We would begin with the discussing what is the difference between nanoscale and microscale studies. So microscale is something that we have been studying till now. So as we move down to nanoscale, what are the important difference? So and then again, so why we are studying nanotechnology for lab on a chip devices? So we would be trying to find out our motivation for that. And this would be followed by certain case studies where we would begin with a case study of a typical pressure driven flow. Which is a very common example of, be it a syringe or be it anything that is used for such diagnostic devices or tools. And we would see what tools are used to study such devices at nanoscales. That will be followed by another case study of a very important phenomena that is often used for propulsion of fluids that for on-chip devices, that is phenomena of capillarity, and we would be seeing how does a capillary flow at nanoscale appear to be. And finally, since we are dealing with this course focuses on medical diagnostics, we would be studying a very specific biological phenomena that is studied on lab on a chip systems, that is DNA on a chip. Okay. By the end of this lecture, I believe that the audience would have a comprehension of the physics at nanoscales and would also be familiarized with the various tools that are used to study such fluids under nano confinement for lab on a chip applications. So, for a layman, the word nano would typically signify a nano car or an iPod nano. So, in common perception, nano has been used to signify anything that is smaller than its usual counterpart. Nano originates from the Greek word for dwarf, and mathematically it is 1/1000th of a meter or 10 to the power -9 meter. Then again, anything having a conduit length between 1 to 100 nanometer is comes under the purview of nanotechnology or nanoscience. And there are several terms that are associated with your nanotechnology. One of them being nanofluidics, where we study fluid flow through conduits of dimensions of the order of nanometer. A very associated and commonly confused term is nanofluids, where we study flow or properties, transport properties around particles having diameter of the order of nanometers, few nanometers ranging from 1 to 100 nanometer, which may or may not be confined within conduits of nanometer dimensions. So that is nanofluids and nanofluidics, and you understand that nano is a buzzword today and is being used maybe at certain points technically and certain points just for the meaning of it. So the interesting question now that we can pose, why nano has become the buzzword or why it is so important? It is very important because this 10 to the power -9 has a significance. And in order to comprehend the significance of this 10 to the power -9 term, let us digress a bit, and I would tell you about a small anecdote. So not many people know about this anecdote, and it is worth spending about 5 minutes to discuss this story. So I hope you would apologize this digression from the technical discussion here. So all of you must be knowing Benjamin Franklin, the person who did the kite experiment to show that lightning has electricity. So Benjamin Franklin was obviously one of the founding fathers of USA, and he liberated the then US colonies from UK. But by ethnicity, he was a person from UK, United Kingdom, and also he used to attend the meetings of the Royal Society. And obviously, he had a lot of properties in UK, and he used to go for this picnic sort of stuff into near a pond near London, and that pond was called Clapham Pond. So he used to pack his lunch and travel the water in a boat, and he used to do something playfully. He used to put a teaspoonful of olive oil into the water and observe something which all of you have observed. So what happens when you put oil in a tank of water? It would form a layer, right? It would still the waves. So if there are ripples on the water in general because of wind or motion or any perturbation that is supplied to it, putting oil would make those ripples stationary. You won't see those ripples. So if you tilt your head and look at the surface of the water, you would see a zone that has been demarcated because of the oil. And every time he repeated the experiment, he observed that the waves are still over a quarter of an acre. So he presented these findings in the Royal Society meeting, and so this was around 1774, before even USA got its independence. So yeah, hence he was allowed to be a part of the Royal Society. Obviously, after 1776, I am not sure if he has attended any Royal Society meetings in UK. So in 1774, he did this and asked people what is the probable underlying physics of the problem that a teaspoonful of olive oil would always steal away for a quarter acre of water. Unfortunately, at that point of time, no one could provide the answer. Royal Society is full of brilliant people, but no one did a small division. And what is the division? Volume of oil divided by the area would give you dimensions of length. And that division was done in 1890 by Rod Rayleigh. And he showed that dividing the volume of oil by the area of the water would give you dimension of a monomolecular layer of oil. And if you do that division, obviously you can use your calculator to do the conversion. So you can find out how much, so about 10 ml of oil divided by a quarter acre would give you the dimension of 10 to the power minus 9 meter. And precisely 1 nanometer or 10 to the power minus 9 meter is the order of magnitude of a molecule or atom. And hence, when we come down to the nanometer level, it becomes very, very important because we have reached molecular dimensions. So any manifestations of molecular property becomes very important. So be it a medical diagnostic test or be it drug delivery, we are at the atomic level and we can segregate everything at the atomic or molecular level. So if you are to treat a tumor, so you understand that treating cancer or tumor is very important because and very critical because we want only the malignant cell to be destroyed, not the healthy cells. So, and for that, whatever medicine that needs to be injected or needs to be supplied to the patient should have the capability to only kill the malignant cells, not the healthy cells. And at that point of time, we would be using some excuse me. Yes. I am taking a class. Please later after 5 p.m. Please. Can I have your card? I will call you. Please close the door after 5 p.m. Okay. After 5 minutes. 5 p.m. 5 p.m. I'm sorry. So basically, if you can go to a molecular precision, you can see how a malignant cell and healthy cell are different from a molecular perspective, and you can tune the properties accordingly. Right. So hence, use of nano in lab-on-a-chip devices is so important. So this is what is the essence of the story that we discussed here. So although nanoflows and microflows look very similar, they look like physics that stem from one another. However, they are completely different paradigms. While micrometer dimensions can just be an extension to the continuum mechanics with certain modified boundary conditions, for nanoscale we need completely different apparatus to study those flows, and the physics is entirely different because these are the scales where all the laws governing the bulk properties that are our laws of regular differential calculus fail to hold good. the interfacial properties become so important that we need to define newer gradients at that scale. And so often something, for example, Fourier's law of heat conduction, which tells that temperature difference between two plates is uh, is temperature difference between two plates divided by the thickness of the plate would be proportional to the heat flux. That might not hold true when we come down to layers which are atomically thin, and hence we would need certain additional investigation techniques, one of them being direct simulation Monte Carlo or molecular dynamic simulations to study such flows. So we would be discussing what are these in the future course. So why would we be willing to study things which are at molecular dimensions, and what are the importance? So apart from medical field, there are certain specific important specific applications in which nanoscale is very important. So so most of us, if not most of us, some of us do wear this glasses, right? And these glasses have certain properties like if you come out of the AC and if you are in a very humid place like Kolkata or somewhere in South India, they tend to get fogged. Okay. Also, with time, if you put your finger somewhere in the glass, it would get a smudge. So, and you see nowadays lenses are available which give you a coating for some extra money, which would prevent the lenses from getting fogged or getting this smudge. And so this is not very difficult. They just put an extra coating without any problem with the optical situation there. But one of the common things that you must have noticed if you have ever gone for such additional layering is that such lenses scratch very easily. So what I am doing basically, I am trying to alter the molecular properties of the glass by a film coating so that fog or dust particles do not deposit on it. However, as a result, what I am doing, I am compromising the cleaning power of the lens. So as a result, when I try to clean them with some spray or some cloth, I would tend to induce certain scratches, minor scratches in them. And once those scratches have been sustained by the glass, that would gradually increase. And why that would gradually increase, we would also see in this lecture in certain times. The same goes for holds true for your mobile screen. So that is also something very similar. If you go to a shop and ask the person to put a screen guard on your mobile, the person would ask you, do you want to go for a matte finish or a clean finish? So, and he would tell you the advantage of matte finish is that you would exactly you would not be getting the phone very smudged. Your fingerprints won't be sticky, oily fingers would not be leaving a print on the phone, but you would be losing on the optical resolution, on the optics of the phone. On the other hand, if you have a very polished polished screen guard, then the phone would appear as if there is no intervening layer, optical layer between it, but it would get easily smudged. Again, dilemma between a clean surface versus a optically perfect surface. Same goes for your car or your bathroom tiles, where always cleaning versus non-staining has a competition. So if the ability to go down to nano level would give us the capacity to clean the stain as well as keep it hydrophobic or repel the water so that there is no water logging, there is no smudge on the phone. So these are some of the aspects which are very important when we are designing various medical equipments, because handling medical equipments, and especially when we are going to handle medical equipments under very inexpensive conditions, so that a semi-trained medical practitioner is able to use or install a medical device, we have to take care that it should be able to repel dust and also should be able to clean it, and hence the nanotechnology kicks in there. Then again, several kind of detection techniques. Most of us have done a complete blood count technique test, or under the current scenario, most of us had to go through the painful COVID testing procedure. So all this procedure rely on a thing, that is, it would have to have a chemical reaction in order to show some visible change in terms of color or concentration, titration, or something like that, so that we can gauge the amount of nutrients or RBC, WBC, or such stuff in it, or the presence of certain antigens or antibody in a sample of biological fluid. And if that is required to be done in a very small conduit, it is very important that we ensure that the reaction occurs. And for the reaction to occur, we have to ensure mixing. But one of the problems with small conduits is that the Reynolds number in such conduits is extremely small. And if we have such a small Reynolds number, that won't allow any sort of introduction of turbulence or any sort of mixing. Because you understand, Reynolds number is proportional to the characteristic length scale. And if my characteristic length scale goes down to nanometer, my Reynolds number is much, much less than 1. So in such a case, we have to introduce certain molecular stickers at nano level, which would cause local recirculation. Independent of the Reynolds number, it would recirculate the particles, allowing mixing to happen inside the channel of nanometer dimensions, and allowing the reaction to proceed without any hindrance. So that is another aspect why nanofluidics is important for your lab-on-a-chip devices. The other thing is prevention of fouling. So, so fouling is a pretty common phenomena which you must have observed in membranes of RO and other things. So obviously in a macro scale it is a huge problem, but when we come down to micro and nano scale, this is again a bigger problem, because say for example, I am trying to test. I believe tomorrow you would be having a lecture on blood, and you, with the basic understanding, you know that blood is a non-Newtonian fluid. So it is somewhat different from water. So it is basically a colloidal suspension of different cells dispersed in plasma. And if my diagnostic device is handling blood, more often than not, it would be possible that some of the corpuscles would be getting deposited on the walls, which also happens with the human bodies and capillary. You understand that choking of the artery or capillary, a phenomena which leads to heart attack after sometimes, and for which one might need a bypass surgery, is also a property where droplets of cholesterol tend to accumulate in the artery and get hardened. So that is also a process of fouling. So when we are talking of a lab-on-a-chip device, and be it micro or nano scale, fouling is a huge problem. And in order to ensure that these corpuscles or particles do not deposit them on the wall, we have to ensure to tweak them at the nanometer level so that these particles tend to get removed or washed away. So these are certain applications which makes study of nanofluidics and nanotechnology an important paradigm for lab-on-a-chip devices. And obviously, the most important aspect is that is that we love things that happen for free. We love free gifts that are available, and hence all the reactions that need to occur on a lab on a chip device for diagnostics have to happen for using the least expensive method. And for that, we would have to have a process that would trigger the flow without any external energy or pressure applied to it. One of the simple ways to do it is to do it in a lab on a CD platform, where the CD is rotated, and as you might have studied in the previous modules, that the centrifugal force that is exerted because of the rotation of the CD ensures that the fluid that is placed on the center of the CD is distributed uniformly towards the periphery. But that might not be the only force that is sufficient in driving the fluid around the periphery. We might need certain additional bolstering from the surface properties in terms of capillary force. And hence, we might need to tweak the surface of our conduit so that these fluid properties are altered in such a way so we have transport of fluid in a pumpless fashion, or simply at the cost of surface tension. So this is something that that is important, and hence we would be studying the capillary flows. So so that gives us the motivation of the study, and to begin with, as a case study, we would have the most common case of a pressure driven flow, or which is called a plain Poiseuille flow. At this point, if you have, although this is motivation pretty much general lecture, if you have any question, you can quickly ask it, or we would move ahead with the pressure driven flow. If there are no questions, let us quickly go ahead and recapitulate how does a pressure driven flow look like. So we understand that when we have a parallel plate separated by a fixed distance, or a circular cross section, a pipe, and we have a pressure gradient driving that flow, we obtain something like a parabolic flow profile as shown in the figure. And obviously, intuitively, we understand that which can again be observed by just pressing a toothpaste tube. So if you press a toothpaste tube onto your toothbrush, you see the paste that comes out also comes out, the edge of the paste comes out in this shape, because we understand at the center of the channel, we would have maximum pressure gradient and minimum resistance, leading to highest flow. Also, at the periphery, there is maximum friction, leading to lowest flow, and hence the equation for the velocity profile is given like this, which is 1 by 2 mu being the viscosity, dp dx is the pressure gradient, y square minus b square. So this happens when my axis system is like this, and you understand whether so this is 0, this is plus b, and this is minus b. So if I am at plus or minus b, my velocity would be 0, and maximum at when my axis is 0, and which is equal to sorry, there is another term. So usually dp dx is negative, so it takes a negative term with it, and that gives us the maximum velocity. Now this is true for a case where where the continuum hypothesis is valid. When we move down to nanoscale, so one of the major assumptions of this type of flow fails. And what is this assumption? We assume that velocity at the wall is zero by the fact that the exchange of momentum between the fluid layers next to the wall and the wall is complete. So, since the fluid layer is, since the solid layer is stationary at the wall, the layer next to it would have a momentum which is the fluid layer next to the wall layer, which is equal to the layer of the momentum of the wall, and hence that is also zero, making the velocity to be zero. But as we scale down our system, we understand that fewer and fewer wall molecules would be coming in contact with fewer and fewer water molecules. As a result, this exchange of momentum, these collisions, would not be much frequent, and as a result, uh, we would have a mismatch of momentum between these two layers. As a result, when we would go down to micro or nano flows, we would have something like this. So basically, you would have the wall velocity starting from some value, finite value, which is non-zero. And if I draw a tangent at this point and let it meet this, I would get something that is called the slip length or LS. Okay. So one of the challenges is to determine this slip length. Obviously, when you are at micro scale, you just empirically determine the slip length based on the type of wall you are using. If it is a rough surface, the slip length might be small. If it is a smooth polished surface, slip length is more. And more often than not, we try to relate it to the wettability of the surface. So we try to classify the surfaces as being hydrophobic or hydrophilic. Hydrophilic surfaces are surfaces which attract water, and hydrophobic surfaces are surfaces which repel water. So a hydrophobic surface, since it repels water, we would be saying that the slip next to the wall for a hydrophobic surface is more as compared to a hydrophilic surface. As a result, we try to define a slip which by equation is given in terms of this. So all of us know all of us know that for Newtonian fluid, the shear stress next to the wall is given by this expression, that is mu multiplied by the gradient of velocity at the wall. Now, going by the argument that we said that with the non-zero wall velocity, we draw a tangent and we have a modified boundary condition which gives us a slip length value which is a function of the finite non-zero velocity of the fluid, at the wall divided by the gradient of the velocity at the wall. So this is a modified boundary condition which would satisfy my equation when the continuum laws are no longer holding good. And that is true for microscale and nanoscale. And I believe that you have been introduced a bit about this. So, and to get a brief historical perspective, Navier, who designed the Navier-Stokes equation, was a mathematician, and he himself postulated this boundary condition as a part of mathematics without realizing the physical significance. Obviously, when micro scale flows were studied, we realized a little significance of this, but with nanoscale, it became more important because it not only this was a boundary condition, but this is a parameter that needs to be determined. And in order to determine that parameter, we have to we have to quantify this parameter in terms of the wettability of the property, because we understand by intuition that a surface which is non-wettable would be repelling water and hence would be introducing very high slip length. A surface which is wettable would be attracting water and having low slip length. And as a result, we need something to quantify this. And that quantification term comes from the Young's equation, or something that we have studied in high school, is the angle formed by a droplet of water on a stationary surface. A stationary droplet on a stationary surface, and that is specifically called the contact angle of the water or the fluid. So for water, we know that whenever the surface is wetting, the contact angle is less than 90 degree, for which phenomena of capillary rise occurs. If it is not wetting, then the contact angle is greater than 90 degree, for which capillary depression occurs. So again, we know that water wets glass, mercury doesn't wet glass. So contact angle of water on glass is less than 90 degree or acute. Contact angle of mercury on glass is obtuse or more than 90 degree. And so now the challenge for nanofluidics is that to find a relationship where we can connect the slip length with the contact angle here. Okay, so this is the most important challenge, because this, you understand, contact angle, as you can see, so these, what you see here are water molecules. They are trying to settle on a surface of the water. So this is a supremely magnified view of a few number of water molecules trying to sit on a surface. What you see here on the pink color surface is a partially wetting surface. So the water molecule would spread, or water molecules would spread on the surface, but not spread completely, forming a contact angle of about, say, 50 degrees, what you can see from here. Contrary to that, the yellow surface that you see is a completely non-wettable surface, and for which these water molecules, so you can see that, so if I think if most of your screens, you would be able to see that water molecules, what I say, are a combination of red and white colored particles. Red indicating the oxygen molecules and white indicating the hydrogen molecules. So a typical water molecule would look like this. So these H are red and white is the the red is the oxygen and the white are the hydrogen. And you see certain molecules, because of their energy, have evaporated, and based on the interaction energy, it is either forming a acute contact angle droplet, obtuse contact angle droplet on a surface which is non-wettable, or if the surface is completely wettable, like you see on a glass surface, untreated glass surface, and drop some water on it, it completely spreads out in a film. So that is a perfectly wetting surface having a theta. So the primary concern of ours when we go for nanofluidics to study such transport on lab on a chip devices is to connect the parameter, the mathematical parameter of slip length, which would give us a closed form equation solution to this contact angle theta, which is something very much observable. So how do we bridge this gap? That is the first question. And for bridging of that gap, we would need certain tool. So we would need to approach towards a solution. And what is that solution? That solution is in terms of studying the molecular properties, because continuum properties as a whole would not give us the solution. We would need to go and study the molecular properties. So molecular properties can be studied in two ways. One of the ways is the statistical way. So what is statistical way? We start by taking, say, the most simplest case. So it is a straight line and I have a molecule. I know that after some time, the molecule would might be going here or here. So by probability, I give it a particular weight to either jump to this slot or this slot, and then run the simulation. So this is t equal to 0. So let us say at t equal to 1, my molecule has left this slot empty, this slot it did not go to, and it has come to this slot. Now, again, at t equal to 2, I need to find out whether the molecule jumps back to its initial slot or next slot. I assign it a weight and do it. So it is, if you can compare the situation to a person who has gotten drunk or intoxicated and trying to reach home. He is taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps backward. And then after maybe 1 hour, we would try to see how much distance he has covered from the place where, from the club, say, from which he came out drunk to his home. So that is a problem. So similarly, molecules, we have shown these molecules are also intoxicated and there is no definite direction to its motion. And they are moving randomly with particular weights assigned. Then we can make this problem more complicated by making it two-dimensional. So at a particular instant, there are 4 positions to which this molecule can switch. And then again, we can make it 3-dimensional and have another axis. Not only that, we can have multiple molecules. So let us say in a particular case where this molecule has come here and there is another molecule already sitting here. So if the molecule decides to jump over to this place, there would be what? There would be a collision. And as a result of the collision, there would be repelled back. It might be elastic collision, and a lot of other things. So what the process I have explained here is a statistical process where we let probability determine what would be the future course of placement of the molecules, and we allow this probabilistic run to move to carry on for certain amount of time and try to see what new configuration I have my system has come to. So this is typically done, say, when we have a gas enclosed in a chamber and we assign all the molecules a particular location, and then the molecules are free to move and independently of each other, and there are forces of attraction and repulsion between each other. And let us say after 10 to the power 9 steps of E, we try to see what is the trajectory that each molecule has traveled and how it has come to this new location. And that new location is called another ensemble. And then we study what are the difference of properties of the old ensemble and the new ensemble. And hence, probabilistically, what are the states between which the system can move. So these set of simulations are called Monte Carlo simulations. So they are sort of important when we are trying to study a system of, say, heat transfer on a chip. So often heat transfer is associated with an insulating material, which is sort of a membrane or a non-structured fiber. And since there is no structure, we just assign a probability to the these heat phonons and try to see how does they evolve and what is the temperature of my final state. I'm not interested where my phonons are exactly located after 5 minutes. I'm just interested what is my final temperature. And for that case, we can simply do Monte Carlo simulations to find out what is the final temperature. As opposed to the statistical or probabilistic case, there is a deterministic case. So how does a deterministic case vary from this? So we have a distribution of molecules, and as you understand from your very basic high school knowledge, whenever there is a distribution of molecule, we have a field. It might be an electric field for that matter. And if there are n number of particles in that system, particle 1 is interacting to each of these n minus 1 particles. And by Newton's third law, particle 1 is attracting or repelling. So it is interacting by force F1 to this n-1 particles. And similarly, this n-1 particles as a whole is interacting with that same force F1 in magnitude and opposite in direction with this particle 1. So this allows us to define a field for that particle. And once we have defined a field for that particle, we can determine what is the energy that is embedded in that particle. Once we determine the energy, we can integrate it and obtain what is the force on that particle. Once we have obtained the force, we can simply divide it by the mass of the particle to determine the acceleration. Now, once the acceleration is determined, we can simply integrate the acceleration to obtain velocity and finally integrate to obtain the distance. And thus, deterministically, from the force field, we can find out that after n number of time steps, where my particle is going to reside. Okay, just a small correction. I said integrating energy to force. No, it is not integrating energy to force. It is differentiating energy to force. Okay, so that is one error which I mentioned. However, you integrate acceleration to obtain velocity and then integrate velocity to obtain displacement. Okay. So whatever I mentioned here, it is expressed here in terms of equation. So this equation right here is the Newton's second law. So mass into acceleration would give you the force, and by integrating each of these terms, you would obtain the displacement, and then you update the displacement to obtain the new force field for particles 1 to n, and then keep on updating the force field to get newer and newer descriptions. So what we are trying to do here is to connect the parameter slip length, which is the mathematical parameter, to a molecular parameter theta or contact angle via calculating the second law of Newton's second law balance, which is force equal to mass into acceleration for each molecule that is residing in the system. So you are coming down to one molecular level, because remember, we have come down to a level of nanofluidics where molecular interactions are very important, and we have to consider each and every molecule, integrate them, do a huge summation to obtain that equation, and finally update the position to get the final result. So this is how a molecular dynamics simulation program is run, and that would give us insight of connection of slip length and your. So we can discuss a lot about this algorithm, but we would not. Rather, we would spend some time in discussing how do we determine this expression, this or this expression, that is the force on a particular molecule. So for the force on a particular molecule, we need to find out what is the nature of that molecule. And for that, we need to, along with the geometry, put the force field for each molecule. And this force field needs to be find out for various types of molecules, because you understand various molecules react differently. So water wets glass, but mercury doesn't wet glass. Hence, the force field between water and glass and mercury and glass is going to be completely opposite to each other. So in that attempt, we try to develop different types of force field, and in notion, let us try to see what a force field exactly means. So a field is basically the interaction energy between two particles A and B as they come in contact matlab come in field of each other. So if particle A is exerting a force on particle B, so they are in each other's force field, and there should be a law by which they interact. So for gravitational force, it is pretty much simple. So you understand, when two objects are at infinite distance, the gravitational force that is acting between them tends to zero, because gravitational force is given by this expression. So if R is infinity, there is no force between it. As they come closer to each other, the gravitational force increases and keeps on increasing. Hence, whenever there is whenever the sun expands and there's a planet nearby, it tends to attract it and absorb the planet within its periphery. Also, large planets like Jupiter and Saturn would cause smaller planets to break and form an asteroid belt near their orbit, so that these planets come closer because of the gravitational attraction. The opposing force there in that case is the centrifugal force. As opposed to that, when we talk about molecular scale, we we are more often than not talking about electromagnetic force or electrostatic force. So in those cases, two particles would be interacting with each other at a long would not be interacting with each other at a long distance. As they would come closer to each other, there would be an attractive energy, and they would attract each other. And finally, when they come very close to each other, they would start repelling each other. So, based on this electrostatic force concept, we try to see what are the various models of force field that can be proposed. So, the simplest of them all is the model of two, say, two duos balls that come in contact of each other. So when they are at a finite distance, there is no force between them. You apply some external force and try to bring those balls closer to each other. Until and unless they touch each other, there will be no. Sorry, I could not. Yeah, I could not hear the question. Can you kindly repeat the question?
95. 95. 96.
Yes, Sanatan. Are you asking a question or you have been unmuted accidentally?
Think so?
Sorry, give me a second to mute Sanatan. I think there was some.
298.
Okay. So based on that, we would be so when they come in contact with each other, there would be no attraction, but the moment they touch each other, there would be infinite repulsion, because they are solid spheres, and from that we develop something called the Hertz sphere model, where the interaction energy interaction energy is mapped with the radial distance, and after a particular point, which is the sum of the diameter of the sum of the radius of the two particles, or the diameter of a single particle, if both the particles are of equal size, we would have infinite repulsion. As opposed to that, we can also deal with soft sphere model, because you understand that molecules are not exactly hard balls, but they are rather a solid nucleus surrounded by a cloud of electrons. So, so when two particles are at infinite distance, they would be attracted towards each other, and after the electronic clouds overlap, there would be repulsion, and finally there will be maximum repulsion when the positive core of the nucleus would be repelling the other positive core. So a soft sphere model doesn't consider attraction, but it considers repulsion, which increases gradually. And finally, beyond the distance, when the nucleus of particle 1 reacts with the nucleus of particle 2, we have repulsion which increases infinitely. Okay, so based on this, the scientists try to see the experimental observations and try to see various spectrometric experiments and solve the Schrodinger's equation to find out how does this interaction potential look like. Okay, and based on it, they saw that when two particles are at infinite distance, there is no interaction between them. They come closer to each other, the attractive interaction starts getting increasing. And finally, it reaches a maximum attractive interaction, beyond which the repulsion forces take over. And that keeps on increasing. And so what you get is something like this. So at infinite distance, no attraction, maximum attraction at a certain point, and then repulsion. So using this model, many scientists tried to come up with a model for this, which is more complicated than the hard sphere or soft sphere model. And the most successful model of this is the Lennard-Jones potential model, which was given by scientists called John Lennard-Jones, which would include everything, the van der Waals forces, the Pauli exclusion principle, and everything. So what he did, he proposed that all the attractive forces between two particles, which we would see in a bit, can be expressed as a function of, so attractive forces are a function of 1 to the power r by 6, the various 1 to the power r by 6. Actually, not forces, rather potential, the energy, attractive energy. Okay. Can anyone say how does electrical or the Coulombic force scale as? It scales as 1 by 1 to the power r, because you know that electrical force is given by 1/4 epsilon naught q1 q2 by r square. So energy would be proportional to 1 by r, and hence Coulombic forces scale as 1 by r. So whenever there are two charged particles, they interact, the energy between them scales as 1 by r. So you move, the greater you distance you move, the energy linearly decreases between two charged particles. Instead of a charged particle, if you have a dipole and a charged particle, the energy would scale as 1 by r square. Similarly, if you have two dipoles, it would be scaling as 1 by r to the power 3. And considering in this, the van der Waals forces was shown to vary as 1 to the power r by 6. So we would briefly see how this analogy was done. And in order to save computational cost, this person, John Lennard-Jones, decided that let us see how the repulsive potential scale as. So he saw that the repulsive potential is weaker than the attractive potential, and quite weaker. So as we move away from the particle, the repulsive forces decrease more drastically than the attractive forces. So, but what is the exact magnitude of this index? That is not very easy to calculate from any equation or experiments. So instead of going into very complicated equations, the person decided to scale these repulsive forces as r by 1 to the 1 by r to the power 12. Why so? Because it is simply square of this term. So when you are doing a computational exercise, you would be easily able to have the square of this and find out the repulsive potential. So and hence the Lennard-Jones potential became one of the most fundamental potential to study molecular properties at nanoscale. And today pretty much we have the potential values of sigma and epsilon for pretty much any substance. Uh, so what is basically sigma and epsilon? Sigma is the distance at which there is two particles would neither attract each other nor repel each other. So particles coming from infinity would have a repulsive attractive maxima, and they would start repelling each other up to a point where there is no attraction and no repulsion, and that distance is called the distance sigma. So, however, beyond that, by inertia, the particles would start keep on moving towards each other, and hence repulsive forces would kick in. So that point of juncture is measured at a distance sigma from each other. Epsilon, on the other hand, is the depth of the well, or is the maximum attractive energy between two particles. So sigma has a unit of distance and epsilon has a unit of energy. So that is how any interaction between, or rather interaction between any two particles or a particle and a surface can be given. So this is one of the most important tools if you are to study what is the how the flow of fluids through nanoscale systems. This is a typical mathematical form of the energy, and in order to understand the how these forces stem, so you are as I was mentioning, sorry. As I was mentioning, the attractive forces for electrical energy would scale as 1 by R. Whenever it's a dipole, it scales as you can see here, 1 by R square for A and R cube for force, 1 by R square for energy and R cube for force. Similarly, if it is two dipoles, then the square and the square are multiplied, as you can see here, and the entire attractive potential scales as 1 by R to the power 6. And that is how most of the van der Waals potential is defined. Because what is basically van der Waals potential? It is not Coulombic interaction, but it is interaction between a dipole in part of a molecule and another dipole. So as you know, the common example of water molecule, water is oxygen attached to two hydrogen. So this oxygen has about minus 0.8 of negative charge, and each hydrogen has 0.4 units of positive charge, making it electron neutral as a whole, but on a molecular scale, it is a dipole. There's a charge separation. So you have a positive charge and a negative charge separated by a certain distance. And such dipoles are interacting in the system. So this is a real dipole versus real dipole situation. There are situations where a dipole, say a plus q and minus q, may come across a non-polar molecule and tend to shift the electronic cloud at a particular direction, inducing a dipole. So that is called a permanent dipole induced dipole interaction. Also, there can be a situation where two absolutely neutral molecules come, and by the virtue of the electronic cloud motion, these particles would tend to reorganize the dipole in such a way so the positive would attract the negative, and an induced dipole would induce another dipole. So these are the three types of van der Waals reactions, and this attractive value of 1 by R to the power 6 maps them. And similarly, you understand for each of these cases, there can be a repulsive interaction. So Typically these interactions are respectively called Keesohm interaction, Debye interaction, and London dispersion forces. Dipole-dipole, induced dipole, permanent dipole, and induced dipole interaction respectively. So that is how we model it. There are several models in which we can model our A, and the total energy of a molecule would be given by the stretching of the bond, the bending energy, the torsion energy, and the non-bonded energy. So these are some finer aspects which are not necessary to understand at this point, but we would rather, and obviously Coulombic interaction, the equation I showed, and this is the overall what is happening in the MD. But finally, we are interested in something that is what we promised, is relationship between slip length and contact angle. So as you can see here, we have a expanded or a blown up view of the simulation system, where we can individually see the water molecules with oxygen head here in red color, and the hydrogen head, hydrogen atoms with white color. So these are water molecules arranged in a parallel plate configuration, and we try to simulate a pressure driven flow in it, and by following certain number of steps which are very much trademark, we try to obtain the velocity profile. So what we do, as opposed to the flow profile, as you remember, we have obtained for our continuum analysis, was parabolic with slip or no slip at the wall. We obtain rather molecular velocities here, and for each molecule we try to plot the velocity profile in a graph. So these red lines are the wall. We plot the velocity at each layer along the channel. And very similar to the example of a toothpaste coming out of the toothpaste tube, or the Poiseuille flow or the pressure driven flow that occurs here, we also see that the molecules are also arranged in that way. So the molecules at the center tend to move faster than the molecules at the periphery of the channel. However, the condition that we said that towards the periphery we would have a no slip condition, that is not true, because you see the velocity is pretty high, and if we extrapolate this flow profiles, we would obtain something called a slip length. Now with this knowledge, what we can do, we can define the potential for the wall depending on the contact angle. So for each contact angle, we have a different potential. So say if you have water and glass, we would have a particular value of FR theta. If you have mercury and glass, we have another value of FR theta. We try to incorporate this and try to see what is the slip length. And as a result, we can obtain a mapping of the slip length. So from this plot, we can connect slip length and theta, and then precisely decide what type of device would be needing what kind of flow. So there are certain devices where we need to expedite our flow. We need more flow rate, and for those cases we would need to have a flow where the slip length is positive, or we are obtaining a throughput more than that predicted by continuum hypothesis. On certain cases, we might be needing a slower flow rate. Say, for example, you are trying to cool a electronic chip using a small coolant circuit. And obviously, to cool the chip more efficiently, we need more residence time of the fluid. And for that case, we would need a sluggishly moving fluid. So what we would do, we would have a negative slip length, which can be also tweaked by these interaction parameters. And for that negative slip length, we would be introducing a stick, and as a result, we would be having a sluggish or slower movement. So this is the first case study, and this is of a pressure-driven flow, and this is the tool of molecular dynamic simulation which is used. So at this point, we would stop and allow you to ask any questions if you have, and then we would move on to the next two case studies.
So this slip length concept is valid for nanoscale phenomena, or is it valid for micro scales or milli? Or I mean, where is the fine line? I'm just asking.
See, yeah, very good question. So slip. Technically speaking, there is no line that would distinguish the point at which you would be applying a slip length. Even you can have a slip for a macroscopic flow. So there are certain parameters that you need to take into consideration, and that parameter is what is the exchange of momentum that is occurring at the boundaries. If the number of the ratio of wall molecules interacting with ratio of fluid molecules at the boundary is less, there would be complete exchange of momentum, there would be no slip. If it is more, then there is going to be slip. For example, if you have a large channel and if you have a rarefied gas, so it is a partial vacuum, so you would be having less number of air molecules or fluid molecules in the system. As a result, the number of air molecules that would be striking the wall to exchange momentum would be less. So irrespective of having a large channel, you can have slip, right? On the contrary, even for a micro channel, if you have sufficient exchange of momentum or a sticky channel, you won't be having slip. So it is very specific to the system, and you need to determine what is the mean free path, how much the molecules of that particular fluid is going to travel between two successive collisions, and what is the characteristic dimension of the system to ensure that there is sufficient number of collisions with the boundary and there is complete exchange. Okay, so this boundary line is very vague, and as I explained, for micro scale, yeah, you have slip length, but that slip length can be artificially defined because you know a limit beyond which it cannot increase or decrease. But for nanoscale, we do not know what is that limit. So the only solution is to do a Newton's second law analysis, because your channel might be of 10 nanometer and your slip length might be 100 nanometer. As drastic as that.
Right, sir. And one more question. I'm not able to visualize the negative slip length concept.
Okay. So that's a very good question. In fact, I wanted to pause for a bit and discuss that. Thank you for asking the question. Very good question. So let me try to draw the diagram. So you understand that this is the case of no slip. Okay. So complete exchange of momentum, and I also do this with black, and this is the case of slip. There can be a case where the exchange of momentum is so drastic that not only the layer adjacent to the fluid, adjacent to the wall, has come down to the momentum of the wall, but also the layer next to it have reduced their momentum. As a result, what you would have is a multi-layer sticking. So you would have something like this. So this happens when, say, you have a ointment or a toothpaste which has dried up. So you can try this at home. You can open a cap of the toothpaste, keep it for a month, and try to push out the toothpaste. You would see it is only coming out from the center. So physically, it is basically multi-layer sticking. So what I have, all these layers are at zero velocity. So they are not moving. My effective channel dimension has been reduced to this green line. But mathematically, if I try to plot this equation, because I need to have the same framework for all these three cases, what I need to do, I need to extrapolate, take a tangent from this and go here till it goes to 0. right? And for that, as opposed to this, sorry, let me complete it with black. So this is LS. So as opposed to this would be a negative of slip length or a sticking length, right? Because the tangent itself has made the zero line ahead of the one.
Right, sir. Got your point. Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If there are no other questions, let us move to the next case study, that is capillary flow at nanoscale. As we have discussed, that it is a very important process to have fluid flow using the surface tension gradient. So we have capillary force of flow of capillarities. So macroscopically, capillarity is nothing but a pressure-driven flow where the pressure uh, pressure gradient is supplied by the surface tension force. And if we try to write down the equation in terms of the various parameters, we would be having the inertial term, or the term that is carrying the fluid in the capillary. So you have this, say, system and a capillary bore dipped in it, so you would have a capillary rise. So this the rising fluid term, the mass term, that is the inertial term, as indicated by this, where L is the length of the filled capillary, L dot is the velocity of the filled capillary, and L double dot is the acceleration, which is equal to the surface tension minus the force of viscosity, which pulls it down, minus the force of gravity. At nanoscale, force of gravity is something we do not consider. We have the rest of the forces and we try to calculate. So a simplified model for this, where we ditch the inertial term and compare only the viscous versus surface tension term, is this, and this gives us the equation, which is called the Lucas-Schwarzman equation. So Lucas-Schwarzman equation is a standard continuum equation which determines all capillary or diffusive flow, and that is sorry, please ignore this, that is given by this. So any diffusive flow, be it capillarity, be it evaporation, be it wetting, is governed by this phenomena. So if you have a droplet and the size of the diameter is reducing with time, the reduction of the size is proportional to under root of t, or capillary rise is occurring, the square of the distance is proportional to time. So this is a universal law valid for any diffusive process. And the concept of slip length that you have just learned can be used to augment the understanding of the Lucas-Schwarzman equation by this. So, however, when people started exploring capillary flows at nanoscale, there was a they faced a problem. What was the problem? The problem was that the results were not matching. While certain flows like carbon nanotubes, which are nanometer dimensions, which are carbon materials with a dimension of nanometers, they showed that water is moving through them. The simulation through using these showed that water is moving through these pores at relativistic velocities, very high velocities. As opposed to that, experimental studies depicted a very low velocity. So, silica vicars are certain naturally occurring compounds which have nanometer dimensions of pore. So people did experiments of water imbibition through the silica vicars and calculated the time and showed that it is somewhat slower than the time scale of the diffusive time scale. So there was a conflict between these two scales. So people started believing that Lucas-Schwarzman equation is good for macroscopic scale, but at nanoscopic scale something happens. So either friction disappears, viscosity disappears, something is happening which is giving a whole lot of velocity at for certain materials and a very less velocity on certain materials. So people try to figure out various terms what would be important for it. So so people try to bring in back the inertial term and said that when my capillary rise is occurring, so let us say this is a bowl and this is capillary. So initially, the moment I dipped the capillary, everything was at this level and the acceleration was infinite. So it is not something that starts with level 0, but it is a lumped mass of water that is already within the capillary, which is being dragged. So it is an added mass or invisible mass that is being dragged. So basically, it doesn't have any physical significance, but it is just an adjustable parameter to match my equation. So that was one of the conditions. The other condition that was used was the dynamic contact angle. So people said that as the velocity of the meniscus changes, the contact angle might be changing, and as a result, as the meniscus moves, certain cases the surface tension is more favorable, certain cases it is not. So this is the most accepted and popular. This was the most accepted and popular notion uh, till a decade ago, where where a major problem came across. Okay, so we would directly go and see this problem. So whatever you do the dynamic contact analysis, and you would see that an ideal Lucas-Washburn thing would give you a linear line. So it is basically L square versus T, and it would be linear. So if you incorporate dynamic contact angle, my contact angle is going to become more and more favorable as capillary rise occur, and hence the rate is going to get faster. But what we observe experimentally in CNT, whatever be the velocity, is something opposite. That the rate actually goes slower than the linear rate. And for that, it was necessary to go back to atomic scale and find out what is the necessary culprit. And again, the necessary culprit was, so this is a typical, again, MD simulation thing, and the necessary problem was again this thing. This is a slip length, and slip length turns out to be variable here. So as the question that was asked, so as capillary rise occurs, very initially it would be multilayer slip, then it would transition to no slip, and then it would transition to stick. This happens because you understand that more and more capillary rise occurs, the greater fluid mass it has to drag into the capillary. And as a result, we have a transition from slip to stick, and finally getting something like this. So the level of filling of the capillary would decide how sluggish it is, and we have a slip length that is not only dependent on the contact angle but also the driving force. So these are certain very important parameters which needs to be taken into consideration when we talk about flows through nanoscale for lab-on-a chip devices. So with this understanding, we would try to take up an example of a medical diagnostic thing for a nanoscale lab-on-a-chip application. That is DNA on a chip. So in this application, so why studying DNA using nanofluidics is important. So all of you know what is a DNA. It is basically a polyelectrolyte. A polyelectrolyte means a long chain polymer which is also charged, and it has a let me go. So it has a helical structure, and there are bases that connect to each other in a particular sequence. So A would be connecting to T, and G would be connecting to C. So and this is this is inarguably the most important molecule that that holds the key to life. And studying of these molecules is not only important for medical diagnostics, but also as well as in forensics, drug delivery, drug discovery, everything. So, uh, so, uh, so it is very important to see how a DNA arranges and what particular peculiar configuration of the DNA might help us to get, help us to recover from certain diseases, help us to gain immunity, or may make us more susceptible to certain diseases. So, uh, study of DNA, as you all might appreciate, is one of the most important things. And in order to study this DNA, we need to somehow destabilize this stable structure, because you see it is a double ribbon and double helical structure. So these ribbons interact with each other and they are connected. So having a reaction with them as a double strand is very difficult, because they are not only connected to each other in this fashion, but also it is in a spiral and helical way, twisted. So the easiest option is to somehow straighten this DNA, so that, so what we do, we try to do a DNA lysis. So break down the DNA into two independent single strand and try to straighten it out in a system. And what is the most easiest system to do this is to force this DNA through a nanopore, because otherwise doing optical tweezers, molecular handling is very, very difficult. So the easiest way to make it straight is to force this DNA to enter a nanopore. And that is where the DNA on a chip technology comes into play. So we take a single strand DNA, try to push it through a nanopore, try to have reactions in it, and try to see what is the pattern of the DNA. So if there is a problem with the DNA, if there is certain things we need to, be it a detection, be it a drug delivery, be it simple test, it would be easy to sequence and perform it in a nanopore. So, so with that motivation, we try to see what are the aspects of a DNA on a chip technology. Okay, so we would come back to this. So one of the so there are certain challenges that are involved in translocation of DNA. Firstly, we need to fabricate a nanopore which would be able to straighten this DNA. So it is not just enough to solute a DNA in a solution and place it on beside the nanopore. We have to ensure that DNA enters the nanopore, so that helical structure straightens out and enters the nanopore. And then we need to measure the readings of the current and the voltage, because DNA is a charged molecule. It has charges, and based on the charges, we would be able to predict the properties of the molecules and any defects or any problems that are with the DNA. So we need to measure those charges. So those are something which comes under under broad purview of fluid mechanics, electronics, and a multidisciplinary field. But the most important part of it is to control the speed of the DNA in the channel. So we understand that if by hook or by crook we have managed to get our DNA into the channel, it is not sufficient that the DNA would swiftly move out of the nanopore. We would want the DNA to stay in the nanopore. And more often than not, it is not so. In an ideal case, what we would want an assay which is extremely long, and we would want the coil of DNA to enter the assay, become straight, and then gradually flow through, and we would have multiple points at which we can do the testing, do current measurement, voltage measurement, colorimetric measurements to test the properties of the DNA. But manufacturing such a huge nanopore, fabricating such a huge nanopore is often impossible. So rather what we have, we have a short nanopore. We have two reservoirs on either side of it, and we somehow, by electric field or some mechanism, we force the DNA to enter the nanopore. And as a result of the confinement, the DNA straightens out. But we want this DNA to stay here for a bit longer. That's why we need to slow down the speed of the DNA. So slowing down the speed of the DNA from a molecular level is very difficult. So in order to bypass it, we try to use the properties of the DNA, that is the electronic charge on the DNA. So this DNA molecule has certain charge, and in order to obtain the benefit from that charge, we try to put some charges on the walls of the nanopore. And that is done by putting polyelectrolytes or a PEL membrane along the nanopore. So PEL membrane is nothing but like a sticker of polyelectrolytes. So basically, if this is my nanopore surface, this PEL membrane would look like this, where each of this polyelectrolyte would have certain charges, and these charges would interact to make the DNA ensure that the DNA either moves slowly, or if in certain cases if we want to increase that speed. So I assume by this time you have understood the brief concept of how a charged particle next to a charged surface behaves. So ideally, if all the electrostatic forces would be in play, so what you see here is a charged surface which has negatively charged particles sticking to the surface, and a solution with positive and negative charges in it which are mobile. So by electrostatic interactions, the positive charges would be aligning themselves along with the stationary charges on the wall, and however, because of the thermal motion, certain positive and negative charges would be randomly moving in the next layer. As a result, you have a more or less immobile layer, which is called the Stern layer, and a mobile layer, which is called the diffuse layer. And the combination of these two layers is called the electric double layer, and this formation of electric double layer next to any surface causes several phenomena, and these phenomena are usually related to motion, relative motion between charges, fluids, and the wall, and they are clubbed together under the phenomena of electrokinetics. So the example that I gave here, that the DNA and polyelectrolyte interacting and slowing down or speeding up the DNA comes from these similar principles of electrokinetics, and physically it looks something like this. So you have two reservoirs, electric field is applied, DNA is negatively charged, so the application of electric field would cause the DNA. So if electric field is applied from bottom towards up, DNA would be moving from the top direction to the bottom direction. This green colored layer next to the wall is the polyelectrolyte membrane, and because of the presence of this polyelectrolyte membrane, the charges in the channel would redistribute and would cause a slowing down of the DNA. And as discussed here, DNA has 4 base pairs, and depending on the location of the base pairs, I would be getting certain current response or signal response, and I would be able to say which part of DNA is passing through which point. So, and if I can control, I'm able to control the speed of the DNA, I will be able to sequence it more effectively. So that is the basic fundamental of a DNA on chip technology. And as I was just mentioning, it can be used in several aspects. One of the things that we are currently dealing with, virology, the COVID-19 virus. So studying the RNA or DNA structure of the virus is very important, and that is done very specifically this way. And medical diagnosis, of course. Then a lot of genetically modified items and things, they are obtained by changing the structure of the DNA, and obviously the first time, for most of us, the first time we heard about DNA was in some TV show dealing with forensic science, and so that is one of the most important. So these are several applications for DNA on a chip technology, and the parameter that we would be discussing in the next few minutes here would be the controlling the speed of the DNA. So, without going much into the mathematical model, we understand that charge distribution can be given by certain equations, and finally, the speed of the DNA can be expressed in terms of in combination of the viscous force and electrostatic force. So this term here, where eta is the viscosity, gives us the viscous force, and this is the force because of the P here. And now by tuning each of these forces, we can ensure that the DNA moves at a particular speed. So these are certain equations which are which can be solved, and using again the concepts that we have developed regarding the slip and contact angle, we can do this analysis for the system and come up with certain observations. So what we do, we change the charge that is on this polyelectrolyte layer, and with variation of charge, we see what is the speed at which DNA translocates through this membrane. And we know if the velocity is always positive, DNA is moving forward. But under certain cases, if the velocity goes negative, we know that the DNA has been blocked in the pole, so it is moving in the reverse direction. So based on our assay, what is required for the DNA, we can design our polyelectrolyte membrane and tune those interactions accordingly in order to obtain the exact velocity for DNA. So we would stop with the lecture at this point and see if any one of you has any questions.
So, what softwares people usually prefer to do MD simulation, Monte Carlo simulations?
Okay, so molecular dynamic simulations is there are a whole lot of freeware that are available. So
yeah, especially I'm asking about open source softwares.
Open source software, yeah. So GROMACS is one of them. So let me write it here itself in the slide. You can also see this, and there are several other softwares which are, sorry, it is correct. So there are several other software. So mostly MD simulation is done using this software. Apart from that, OpenFOAM comes with the Monte Carlo package and molecular dynamics package, MDFOAM and ParaFOAM, all those, for which you can also try that.
Great, thanks, sir.
Any other questions? Okay, if there are no other questions, I would like to thank all the participants. And I believe uh, from the course coordinator or the um teaching assistant who is available here, you would be able to obtain my email ID. Also, I'm a part of the WhatsApp group in which you exchange messages. So if you have any questions, any specific doubt regarding this, please feel free to contact me. And thank you for your attention.